It's Wednesday, February 5th, 2025. Welcome to Make It Make Sense. I'm Grant Herms. It has been a crazy few days since the last episode, and I feel like I'm going to be saying that a lot for the next few years. And today we were supposed to be taking a bite out of what Elon Musk has been doing inside U.S. government agencies. That was until Trump said this.
I do see a long-term ownership position, and I see it bringing great stability to that part of the Middle East and maybe the entire Middle East.
So Trump said that while he was meeting with Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, and I'll get to what taking ownership of Gaza would actually mean in a minute, but what we're going to be talking about today is Trump's newfound, what almost seems like an obsession with expanding the country. Some people are calling it expansionist, some are calling it imperialist. Honestly, I kind of think it's a distinction without a difference. What I'm talking about here when I say those two things is Trump's pushes to buy Greenland or Gaza, apparently, take back control of the Panama Canal, or make Canada the 51st state, which is something he keeps saying jokingly, but also like kind of looking around to see if anybody's going to take him seriously on it at the same time. But this is a thing that I have been thinking a lot about lately as a president who ran twice as a candidate that promised to pull out of international treaties, pull away from our allies abroad, like at NATO or the World Health Organization, who targets our trade partners and wants to close borders to make us a much more inward-facing, isolationist country. Remember, he promised to be a president who wouldn't start new wars and would end wars, even in his inaugural address for that second part. Well, this new push to expand outward is totally at odds with all of those promises, unless you start to look at the influence of particularly the tech billionaires around him, mainly Elon Musk and someone like Peter Thiel, who I'll talk about a little later. But there are ways to look at this new Trump worldview that I've sort of put into four categories, with an extra half category when it comes to Gaza. The first one is an obvious one, which is national security. And let's start in the Arctic with Greenland and Canada. Both the government of Denmark, which owns Greenland, although it's its own autonomous territory, and the Canadian government have said either their territory isn't for sale or they have no interest in becoming a part of the United States. Polls done in both Canada and Greenland found that in Canada, 90% of people did not want to become Americans, and in Greenland, 85% didn't want to become Americans. And Denmark is so mad about Trump's repeated pushes to buy Greenland that they have threatened to cut off our crucial national supply of Legos, which for me would be personally devastating. But from a national security standpoint, what Canada and Greenland have in common is a lot of access to the Arctic. Now, the U.S. is already an Arctic nation. We've got Alaska, right? But that's only in the far northwest. Otherwise, we rely on our allies like Canada and NATO, which Denmark was a founding member of in 1949, in the North Atlantic and far northeast. And the Arctic is a crucial part of the world when it comes to preventing conflicts because so many nations are so close together. Often, we don't think about it because when you think about the countries of the world, you probably picture a map because you can see all the countries at one time instead of thinking about all these countries on a globe where you have to rotate it to see where they all get close to one another. And the Arctic is where some of these countries are at their closest, and that some of these countries are no friends of the U.S. In fact, they're our adversaries. I'm talking Russia and China in particular. So Russia keeps a lot of its Northern Navy fleet up in the Arctic, including a lot of its nuclear submarines, which have nuclear missiles on them. And China sees expanding their military operations in the Arctic as a long-term goal for the growth of China. The U.S. and Canada also currently share control of NORAD, the people that you only think of in December because they're tracking Santa Claus. Well, what they're really there for is what they stand for, which is the North American Aerospace Defense Command, and it was created to detect incoming missiles because the fastest way to strike the U.S. from Russia isn't over the Pacific, but it's up and over the Arctic. The Arctic region is also rapidly changing because of climate change. And according to a report put out back in June by the Department of Defense, melting sea ice is opening up parts of the Arctic Ocean that we didn't have to worry about before. They were a part of what the military calls ocean choke points that were natural barriers to prevent navies from moving around that area easily. Well, those are expected to be gone in 5 years. The DoD is predicting that because of climate change, the Arctic will have its first practically ice-free summer by 2030. If the U.S. or our strong allies don't have a presence up there, it could allow enemies to move freely. On the other side of the equator, Trump wants to retake the Panama Canal, which he said he wants to do, if necessary, by force. Now, again, just like Canada and Denmark, the Panamanian president said that the canal isn't for sale, and neither is the country of Panama. Now, just for a little history here, there's going to be some history in this entire episode. The Panama Canal was started in 1904 by President Teddy Roosevelt, who was part of this period of expansionist presidents. Again, something I'll come to later. But the canal was finished in 1914, and in the process, more than 6,000 people died, most of them low-wage laborers from the Caribbean who were really little more than enslaved people. Many of those people died from malaria or other awful diseases, or were killed in the construction of the canal itself. The U.S. then maintained control over the canal in what was called the Canal Zone, and it was held strictly to a Jim Crow South hierarchy for the folks who lived down there. There was a governor who was appointed by the president, but it was a really segregated area, even well into post-segregation in the mainland U.S. And then, in 1977, President Jimmy Carter signed a treaty to hand over the canal to Panama by midnight of January 1st in the year 2000, and that's what eventually happened. Now, the canal from its beginning, before a canal was even dug, it was just a path, but it was always a globally transforming part of the world that allowed people to travel between the Atlantic and Pacific without having to go all the way around the dangerous South American southern tip. It also meant, once the canal was dug, that navies could pass back and forth easily, and that's why the U.S. built the canal in the first place, so the U.S. Navy could easily get from one side of the world to the other, making it a two-ocean navy, a real sign of power, and something that President Teddy Roosevelt really wanted. Having a two-ocean navy isn't really a thing the U.S. has to worry about anymore. We've got naval bases all over the world. But sending troops to Panama, to the canal, would also mean having a U.S. territory in the middle of some really dangerous parts of the world. It would mean Trump would be able to use the military to likely influence Latin American leaders, likely to threaten military use to stop some kind of migration flow to the north. But he would also be able to cozy up to dictators who have been on the rise, including the new authoritarian president in El Salvador, who just offered to house undocumented immigrants in the U.S. and U.S. citizens who commit crimes in El Salvadorian prisons, which are some of the most dangerous and with some of the worst conditions in the world. Now, the canal has also been under a lot of influence of China recently because so much over-ocean shipping comes from the Chinese. And if it's not ending up in a U.S. Pacific port, it's got to go through the canal. From a national security standpoint, if China gets a lot of influence there, it could mean that if the U.S. were ever to need to get a portion of the Navy fleet, say from Virginia to Hawaii really quick because China, God forbid, was attacking Hawaii, well, the worry is that if China had a bunch of influence in the Panama Canal, then maybe they wouldn't let the U.S. Navy through. Now, the last is Gaza, and this is a pretty clear one, I think. It would give the U.S. a true territory in the Middle East, right next to Israel, our closest ally in the region. Often people say that it is our closest ally, period. But it would also mean taking Gaza by force, likely, and displacing 2 million Palestinians, which Trump said Jordan or Egypt would, quote, give us the land for those people. And he said he wanted to make it a place where they wouldn't want to go back to. I don't really know what that means, but here he is talking about it.
What other countries you think might accept Palestinians from Gaza?
Well, I think Jordan and Egypt will. I know they've spoken about it with you, and they say they're not going to accept. I say they will. But I think other countries will accept also. I think that Gaza maybe is a demolition site right now. I don't think people should be going back to Gaza. I think that Gaza has been very unlucky for them. They've lived like hell. They lived like you're living in hell. Gaza is not a place for people to be living. And the only reason they want to go back, and I believe this strongly, is because they have no alternative. What's the alternative? Go where? There's no other alternative. If they had an alternative, they'd much rather not go back to Gaza and live in a beautiful alternative that's safe.
Now, members of both the right and the left, Republicans and Democrats alike, have not been in favor of this idea over the last 24 hours or so as I'm recording this, because it would likely mean provoking a war with what's left of Hamas or Hezbollah in Lebanon, both of which are backed by Iran, or potentially a war with Iran outright. General control of Gaza would more than likely create a national security risk or national insecurity to the U.S., but like I said, it would give the U.S. a foothold in the Middle East. The next category to think about is the economy. And like I said before, the Arctic is melting quickly, and that means that new shipping routes will be opening up as ice melts. That could mean big business for major shipping companies like Maersk or Evergreen, or even FedEx or DHL would be tripping over themselves to get permits to use those shipping lanes. And then how that works is shipping companies sign contracts with sometimes the countries or the groups that maintain those shipping lanes, and then the cost of that maintenance is then built in to the contracts and passed on to us as the consumer. So eventually, the U.S. gets paid in a roundabout sort of way. And a melting Arctic also has another thing when it comes to the economy. It's easier to drill for oil and gas when the ground is softer, and it's easier to mine for precious minerals. The Arctic Institute, which is a research group of people who I assume are cold all the time and just eat a lot of reindeer jerky, found that the Amerasia Basin, which sits at the very top of North America and is currently being shared by the U.S. and Canada, is the second largest reserve of undiscovered oil and gas in the world, and the Canadian portion is about 20% of the Arctic's oil potential. That means billions and billions of dollars underground that are especially enticing to a president who said it was his vision to drill, baby, drill from the inaugural podium just 2 weeks ago. And then there's the mining. And Canada has tons of mining for what are known as rare earth minerals. These are the things that we need for our phones, or electric cars, for batteries, medical devices. And Canada has got these mines all over the place. And so does Greenland. Just last year, the EU did a survey of rare earth minerals and found that Greenland had some of the richest deposits in the world outside of China, having 25 of the 34 of what are known as critical raw minerals. And you know who needs those? Elon Musk and his tech buddies. Now, I don't know if Musk is in Trump's ear about getting Greenland so he can get cheaper materials for rockets or Tesla cars or dancing robots. I don't know. But it's no secret that the U.S. for a long time has been trying to find a way to be less reliant on China when it comes to these minerals. And it would certainly be much easier for somebody like Musk, who is so close to the White House, or really any of those billionaires who were on stage with Trump 2 weeks ago, to get preferential treatment when it comes to access to those minerals, and the U.S. mining companies would make a killing on selling them. Now, when it comes to the Panama Canal, this one's also pretty straightforward. Control of the canal means control over a large part of global trade. Companies don't want to spend the money on fuel to ship all the way around South America and would likely need to pay to use the canal. And if the U.S. controlled it, it could also cripple Chinese shipping and companies that are closely tied to the Chinese government, putting the U.S. in a much better position to compete with, say, things like manufacturing in China. The next category of why Trump would want these places is much less concrete than national defense or economics. And in fact, the rest of this will be a little less concrete. But we'll start with he's thinking about his legacy. Trump is 78 and is thinking about his legacy as a man and as a two-time president. Right now, his lasting legacy, at least in public life, is becoming the first president to incite an attack on the U.S. Capitol and to become the first convicted felon in the Oval Office. And we know Trump has been thinking about this a lot because he keeps mentioning past presidents. It's something he didn't do in his first term, nor in his first campaign, apart from mentioning them as opponents or things that he's different from them, or saying that he was better than Lincoln or Washington. It's worth pointing out here that presidential historians consistently rank Trump as the worst president in American history, but on the campaign trail, he compared himself to Reagan a lot this time around. And interestingly enough, Reagan almost saved his run to be the Republican nominee in 1976 by including this line into his campaign speeches.
The Panama Canal Zone is sovereign United States territory just as much as Alaska is, as well as the states carved from the Louisiana Purchase. We bought it, we paid for it, and General Torrijos should be told we're going to keep it.
And it was right around the late 70s, early 80s, sort of the Reagan Revolution, that Trump kind of popped online politically, so it wouldn't be a far stretch that as he's nearing the end of the line here, that he's thinking about the president who might have inspired him, which would have been Ronald Reagan. And then there's another president that Trump has had a lot of focus on lately, and that is William McKinley. And Trump, in his flurry of executive orders in the last couple weeks, renamed it back to Mount McKinley. Now, Denali was named Mount McKinley originally as a PR stunt after a prospector in 1896 came back from the Alaskan gold rush and decided to name that mountain something else when he talked to reporters to tell his stories about the frontier. Well, he decided to name it after the Republican nominee for president at the time, William McKinley, who wanted to keep the U.S. dollar pegged to the price of gold, called the gold standard, which meant prospecting would be lucrative. Essentially, it was a historical mistake, the way that people understand it, because the name just sort of stuck. I mean, McKinley never even visited Alaska or saw the mountain that was named after him. He wasn't even president when the mountain was named after him. And just another quick history lesson here. McKinley was initially considered to be a weak president after he was basically bullied into the Spanish-American War by the press and by a surge in populism in the U.S., and was a president who was managed by his political advisors and influencers. But in recent years, some of that thinking has been up for debate among presidential historians. What hasn't been up for debate is that McKinley was an expansionist, with one scholar writing, during his tenure, the United States acquired overseas territories, fought and won a war with a European power, and attempted to set international norms regarding trade with China. In short, the United States emerged on the world stage in new and unprecedented ways. McKinley essentially set up the U.S. to be an emerging world power in a pre-World War era, which is huge for the rest of American history. And Trump is looking at presidents like McKinley and seeing the end of the line coming, and is really striking a tone of how to set a legacy that goes beyond what he has now. And that brings us to the last 1.5 categories here, both of which have to do with a sense of American greatness through expansion. Trump talked about a Manifest Destiny 2.0 in his inaugural address. Manifest Destiny is the now really fraught concept that Americans, but really just white Americans, had not just a right, but a divine destiny to spread westward across North America. Now, obviously, that had a lot of awful, evil consequences for North Americans, settlers from other countries like Mexico, and the environment. But Trump talked about reviving that idea again.
The United States will once again consider itself a growing nation, one that increases our wealth, expands our territory, builds our cities, raises our expectations, and carries our flag into new and beautiful horizons. And we will pursue our manifest destiny into the stars, launching American astronauts to plant the stars and stripes on the planet Mars.
And that theme, especially going to Mars there, is a theme with a lot of tech billionaires who see themselves as saviors of America or the human race, particularly Elon Musk and in part Peter Thiel. Now, Thiel was the co-founder of PayPal, and is a far-right conservative libertarian who wrote a book called The Diversity Myth, which is a direct line to Trump's now attacks on DEI across the government. And Thiel once said in an essay for the libertarian think tank, the Cato Institute, quote, "Most importantly, I no longer believe that freedom and democracy are compatible." The rest of that thing is sort of unintelligible, but not great for somebody who's got the president's ear right now. But Thiel and Musk are also big proponents of what people in these circles are calling a frontier mentality. It's about what they see as a spiritual revival, or as Eric Teastel from the very conservative Center for Renewing America wrote, "The myths that feed the sense we have of ourselves and tales of courage explorers defying the odds in pursuit of their dream of a better life, from Plymouth Rock to Lewis and Clark, the Sooners to 49ers. For 100 years, America's domestic and foreign policy was dictated by the mandate to control our destiny from sea to shining sea." And we can even look to Elon Musk in particular, whose pet projects are colonizing Mars and then potentially the rest of space, apparently, or his company Neuralink that wants to put microchips in our brains, which has been praised as a new frontier. Now, this is something that we can see the influence of these tech billionaires and Elon Musk on Trump. At his core, Trump is transactional. We know that from how he talks and he behaves, and even the things that he's said, like standing in front of the graves of soldiers asking what was in it for them. Though I should say here that Trump disputes that story. But expansion for the sake of it as an ideal, not really Trump's style. And one last thing here is that expanding into Gaza would be beyond manifest destiny. It's a crusade mentality. Putting U.S. troops in Gaza would mean sending an army into the Holy Land for a lot of people. It's something that our brand new Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, has talked about. I mean, he wrote a book literally called American Crusade and has the Crusaders' motto and their cross tattooed on his body. He was caught shouting, "Kill all Muslims" at a hotel bar, which is what a lot of the Crusades were actually about, and has said that he wants the U.S. and the U.S. military to be in a crusade mindset. It's also a mindset shared by end times or rapture pastors, like many of the people you often see praying over Trumps when groups of these evangelists come to visit the White House. These are the Christian nationalists or the rapture accelerationists who want the end of the world to happen sooner. And they have a lot of theories and interpretations in the Bible and believe that starting a war in Israel and or Palestine will help that along. And the thing is, these people aren't just shaping Trump's agenda from the outside anymore. They're active members of the administration now, or they are top leaders in the Republican Party who are now in lockstep with Donald Trump. And I know that that sounds far-fetched, but these are the people who are around the president right now. And okay, if there is anyone left listening at all, I hope this helped make some sense out of where Trump is coming from in this shift to expand America beyond her shores. And I'll say a lot of this too, especially the national defense and national economic stuff, is in line with what presidents from both parties since like the 1950s have talked and worried about. And expanding the U.S. is part of our myth and history that dates back to the founders. James Madison wrote about it, Thomas Jefferson wrote about it, and signed the Louisiana Purchase, which gave us basically a third of the United States. But it's also worth pointing out here that these things are wildly old-fashioned now. The world is smaller and more complicated, and the consequences of bringing 250-year-old ideas into the present day will be more widespread. And we just haven't heard Donald Trump talk about what he would do in these instances to stop those consequences from happening. And I think that is something to think about. All right. That is it for the one of you left listening for today's episode. Please rate and review the show wherever you get your podcasts. Like and subscribe and hit that bell for notifications on YouTube so you don't miss out on any new videos. Subscribe to the Make It Make Sense Substack, where I've got brand new articles up every single day, including one just this week about Elon Musk coming for USAID, our foreign aid program, which he is more or less shuttering by this Friday. But that is just for paid subscribers, so if you want to read it, you got to pay for it. It's just $5 a month. And as always, share the show on social media. It's Mims News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod, all one word, on every platform. I am at Grant Herms on X and Bluesky, and at Grant Herms TV on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Grant Herms, and I'll talk to you on Friday.